All right. Good afternoon, everybody. This is our webinar about supplemental security income. This is being presented by Rachel Leach, who is with the Office of Clients Rights, which is part of the Disability Rights of California. And it's being sponsored by the Family Focus Resource Center. And Family Focus Resource Center is an agency that serves people who live in the San Fernando Valley, the Santa Clarita Valley, and the Antelope Valley. And we serve families who live in that area, and a lot of them have family members who are clients of the North Los Angeles County Regional Center. And we will tell you a little bit more about Family Focus as we go on and share a little bit of information about some upcoming events. This is the first part of a two-part webinar series about SSI, and it's going to focus on individuals who have developmental disabilities. And now I'd like to hand it over to our presenter, Rachel Leach.
Hi, everyone. Oh, sorry, Vicki, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead. Thanks.
Okay. Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel, and like Vicki had said, I am the Clients Rights Advocate from the Office of Clients Rights Advocacy, and we are part of Disability Rights California. And our organization, what we do is we help to advocate for individuals with developmental disabilities to make sure they are receiving necessary supports and services. And like Vicki had said, today we'll talk about Social Security income. I wanted to give this disclaimer before we started the presentation. Because this is a group presentation, we really would like you, when asking questions, to just make sure that you're not sharing any private or confidential information. There would be no right of confidentiality for anything that is said during this training. And just going through what the disclaimer says, we are mandatory reporters and obliged to report any abuse or neglect of disabled adults. Again, this is not a private consultation for legal advice between myself and anybody on this call. If you do have any questions during the presentation about something very specific with very specific information, you can go ahead and give our office a call. And at the end of the presentation, my contact information will be there, and we can have a phone conversation about your specific question. If you're able to, well, the recommendation and what we're asking you to do is when you are asking us questions, to keep them very general, and we will do our best to answer them. And if for some reason a question is asked and I'm not able to give the fullest answer, if I can come up with information later on, I will provide that as well. Okay, so again, we'll be talking about supplemental security income both this week and next week in the second part of this training series. Okay, so first, what is the Social Security Administration? So the Social Security Administration, it is a federal agency, and it is in charge of the Supplemental Security Income Benefits Program. It's in charge of other programs as well, but for the matter of this presentation, we'll be focused solely on Social Security income. And when looking at Social Security, there are specific definitions for how the agency determines and defines disability for both children and adults. So when looking at the definition of disability for a child, SSA indicates that it's an individual who is under the age of 18, and they're considered to be disabled if they have a medically determinable physical or mental impairment. And this medically determinable physical or mental impairment would result in a marked or severe functional limitation, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, and can be expected to result in death, or has lasted or can be expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. And the definition for a disability for an adult is someone 18 years or older, no matter if that person continues to reside with their family. And this individual would be would have the inability to engage in substantial gainful work activity, and that's another term that we'll discuss in momentarily. Again, because of a medically determinable physical or mental impairment, and like the child definition, that's expected to result in death, or has lasted or is expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. So that's how SSA will define disability for children and adults, and they use that definition to determine if someone would be eligible for Social Security benefits. So when looking at determining whether someone is eligible for Social Security, or I'm sorry, for Supplemental Security Income, SSI benefits, Social Security uses something called the sequential evaluation. And this is to decide if an adult or child meets the definition of disability. And it's called a sequential evaluation because there are several steps for both an adult and a child. And if you meet one step, that's where you would stop, and you wouldn't be eligible for, if you meet it in the sense, let me back up. If you meet it in the sense that you, if they're saying that there's a medical determinable impairment and there is one, then you would move on to the next step. If SSA determines that there is no impairment, then it would stop there and you wouldn't move on to the next step. But we'll go through the steps so you can see which ones they are for both adults and children. So,
Oh, Rachel, can I jump in there real quick?
sure, go ahead, Kendra.
It's sequential because the questions are asked in a specific order, and it's the way that they analyze the disability. And for Social Security or SSI, particularly for adults, it's really, the question is, can the individual work or not? It doesn't really depend on the definition or the type of disability that the person has. They really say, with that disability, can that person work? And so it's really looking at the individual's ability to kind of be competitively employed. And so we're going to kind of keep coming back to that. And that's why this evaluation is sequential, because it goes through each step in a very specific order. And it'll help you analyzing either your own case or that of somebody else's to kind of understand the way that Social Security is thinking, because it's different than a medical model or at school or with the regional center. It's a very focused disability determination.
Right. Thank you, Kendra. I appreciate that. So if you're looking at the left side of the screen, we'll start with adults first, and there are 5 steps within the sequential evaluation for adults. So the first question that Social Security looks at is the person who is applying for for supplemental security income, are they working? And within that question of are they working, or if they are working, what are their earnings? And if someone is making at or over $1,310 per month, it is said that that person is engaging in substantial gainful activity. And if someone meets that threshold, the 1310 a month, and they're engaging in substantial gainful activity, then that means that they would not qualify for supplemental security income, and the evaluation would stop there. Now, let's say someone is making $1,000 per month, or they're making no dollars per month because they don't work. Then you would move on to the second question. And that question is that person's condition severe? And so so severity would be, the limits of physical or mental ability to do basic work activities. So basic work activities could include things such as standing, walking, sitting, seeing, hearing, understanding, using judgment, and responding appropriately to supervision and dealing with changes. So those are some of it. That's not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the limitations that Social Security looks at in determining whether someone's condition, that being either physical or mental, is severe. And then if the condition is severe, then you would move on to the next question, which is, does the condition meet or medically equal a Social Security listing? And after this slide or a few more slides, we're going to go through talking a little bit more about the Social Security listings. So if someone meets a listing, then you would move on to, are you able to do your past work? So Social Security would look at whether someone is physically or mentally able to do any job that they did in the past. And generally they look at roughly the past 15 years of work that you've engaged in, or the person who's applying for supplemental security income. If you're not able to do past work, then you would move on to the last question, which is, can you do any other kind of work? And when determining the kind of work that someone can engage in, they look at someone's age, education, work experience, and they look at the work existing in the national economy. If you're not able to engage in any other kind of work, and then because you've made it all the way to the bottom of those questions, you've met the other questions, then you would be eligible for supplemental security income. Now, looking at the children's side, on the right side, the sequential evaluation list is shorter. So again, they look at, is the person applying for supplemental security income working? And then again, they look at whether their condition is severe. So again, that's a limit, a physical or mental limit, being able to do basic work activities. And if your condition is severe, then you move on to the next question of, does the condition meet or medically equal a Social Security listing? So just to break it down just a little bit further, just kind of going back through it, is someone working? So the substantial gainful activity amount, so the $1,310 a month, that number changes every year. So for 2021, the average, if you earn more than $1,310 a month, then Social Security would not consider someone to have a disability, and then you wouldn't move forward to step number 2. Now, against
this is Victoria. Someone asked, is that dollar amount before or after taxes? The $1,310.
That's a really great question. Kendra, do you know if it's gross
Before.
or net?
It's gross.
Okay.
Gross. So
And
before taxes.
the term substantial gainful activity, so the substantial is sort of defined as any work that requires significant physical or mental effort, and then gainful would be any work that's performed for pay or profit, or that would typically be performed for pay or profit. So technically speaking, if you had somebody who volunteered in a job and they were working as if they were getting paid, but they were volunteering, even though they didn't make that substantial gainful amount, that $1,310, in theory, Social Security could say that it was substantial gainful activity because it's the type of work that's typically performed for pay or profit. Don't see it that often, but I always like to give that caveat because Social Security loves to throw a curveball at people from time to time. So just kind of, that's just a little bit more background there.
Thank you, Kendra.
Rachel, there was another question. This is
Sure.
Kathleen.
Hi, Kathleen.
In regards to severe, let's see, the severe definition, they were asking if there's somewhere to find a complete list.
Of what as Social Security would take a look at?
As far as what would meet a severe definition.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you are able to go to, and it's a Social Security website, so SSA.gov, and they have a search bar at, I believe it's the upper right-hand corner, and you can actually search the word sequential evaluation, and the first link on the website would take you to a page, and I believe it's titled "What is a Disability?" or something along those lines, and it actually takes you through the entire sequential evaluation. And that would go through and provide a little more context on the word severe. And it's a little more difficult to navigate, but there is something called the POMS, P-O-M-S, and this is basically like the Social Security regulations, and that also provides definitions for specific words. But I believe the sequential evaluation page, they may also link you to the POMs, which would provide continued examples or more further definition.
There's also, and Rachel's going to talk about it in a couple slides, so the Code of Federal Regulations in the Social Security Act also includes a listing of impairments, and it has a list of all sorts of diagnoses that a person might have, from like a bad, a broken back to autism, the scope of, and it doesn't cover everything, but a sort of by body system. They have a list of diagnostic criteria for, if someone's going to be eligible under autism, it has a list of diagnostic criteria that if you meet that criteria, your condition is considered severe.
Right.
And Rachel's going to get into that. And then I see a question here that says, is this for SSDI or SSI? The disability determination between those two programs, and we won't get into that too much because that's a whole other, Title II benefits are a whole other ball of wax, but the disability, how they determine disability is the same.
Thank you. Okay. So with looking at step 2, is the condition severe? This would be the condition must interfere with basic work-related activities for the claim to be considered. And again, just like we had mentioned, if Social Security finds that the claimant is not disabled, then, and that it's not severe, then you wouldn't move on to the next step in the sequential evaluation. And the impairment must cause more than a minimal limitation in someone's ability to do basic work activities. So I think that adds a little bit more to the severe definition. It has to be more than a minimal limitation. Again, like Kendra was just talking about, and what I'll talk about in a few slides more specifically, is the condition found in the listing of disabling conditions. And if the person applying for the supplemental security income meets the definition or meets the listing requirements, then that condition is so severe that then they would automatically be considered to have a disability. Now, if the condition is not on the list, Social Security may decide that the condition that the individual has is equal to the severity of a medical condition that is on the list, and then that would be found to have met the listing. And if neither of those are applicable, then you would not move on to step 3. So when looking at the listing of impairments, like what Kendra was just talking about, is that with the listing of impairments, there's a description for each major body system, and the impairments must prevent someone from doing gainful activity, or for a child, it's impairments that cause a marked or severe functional limitation. So for instance, the listing of impairment when describing a major body system, it can be an impairment that is skeletal, or something that deals with special senses or speech, something that's cardiovascular, digestive, something to do with skin, a neurological disorder, something that is a mental disorder, or maybe an immune system disorder. So for instance, looking at autism more specifically, this autism, when looking at the listing of impairments, would be considered under their section of a mental disorder category, and it's section 12.10. And for an adult, when determining whether someone meets the criteria for an autism listing, they have to show that there is medical documentation of both of these following categories, whether that there has to be qualitative deficits in verbal communication, nonverbal communication, and social interaction, and also medical documentation that there is significantly restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So once you're able to show the medical documentation of both of those, you also have to show that there's an extreme limitation in one of the following 4 areas, or a marked limitation in 2 of the following 4 areas of mental functioning. The first area of mental functioning is understand, remember, or apply information. The second is interact with others. The third is concentrate, persist, or maintain pace. And the fourth is adapt or manage oneself. From my experience, and I can't necessarily speak to every single major body system. I will say I haven't looked at all the listings for every major body system, but the ones that I have taken a look at, you must show an extreme limitation in one area or a marked limitation in two of the four in each and every listing. So if it's autism or anxiety, or like I said, a cardiovascular issue or neurological issue, you would have to show those either the extreme limitation in one or the marked limitation in two of those four groupings.
I always think
Rachel.
it's, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I always think it's a good idea when you're getting ready to apply for SSI to take a look at the listings first, because how you answer the questions on the form is really important. And if you can use the language that Social Security knows or from their listings, it doesn't always do the trick, but it can help you sort of get past some hurdles sometimes. So, and if you need help finding those listings, you can always contact our office and we can get you that information or shoot you a link to where the listings are. They're on the Social Security's website, but it can be a little complicated to navigate too.
Okay, I think this is Kathleen. I think you just answered one of the questions, so that's great. And then there's another question about applying for a minor versus somebody 18. Our understanding is that the earnings of the guardians, the parents, would be taken into consideration prior to 18, and then at 18 or older, it would be the income of the person applying themselves. Is that correct?
We'll talk a little more about, that's called deeming, and we'll talk a little bit more about deeming as we go on, but yes, when a child is living with the parents, then the income from the parent would be deemed to the child. Someone under the age of 18, I believe, and I will look after this and say if it's incorrect, and Kendra, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the last time that I looked at deeming in the POMs, they may, I don't want to, I thought maybe they deemed income past the age of 18. Kendra, is it to 22 or is it just to 18?
It's to 18.
18, okay.
There are some things around income for children if they're working and it's a school program.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of gets into the weeds a little bit. And somebody's asking if we can post a link to the impairments. I've just pasted it there. And there's a, on that website, it says adult listing and childhood listings because it's different for adults and children.
Right.
So so I just put the link in the chat box.
Thank you, Kendra.
Maybe it was direct. I didn't mean to do a direct message. Let me see if I can do it to everybody. I'm not particularly tech savvy. Sorry, guys.
Okay. So when looking at the listing of impairments for children, so you kind of what we had discussed in the last slide, if a child's disability or a combination of conditions, you could have a combination of more than one listing if that meets the criteria of the listing of impairment. So that's one way to meet the listing. Or if the signs, symptoms, or laboratory findings are equal or severe enough to one of the conditions. So it's not necessarily the same exact condition, but if it's equal to the listing of impairment, then they would find that someone satisfies that requirement. And then if the impairment does not meet or medically equal a listing, but it functionally equals a listing. So it's either it directly meets the listing, it's equal to, or it functionally equals the listing. So with the functionality portion, if this means that Social Security would evaluate the effects of the impairment on the child's ability to function at home, school, and in the community. And in order to determine if someone functionally equals the listing, Social Security takes into consideration factors such as how well does the child initiate and sustain activities, how much extra help does the child need, the effects of structured or supportive settings, how the child functions in school, and the effects of the child's medications or other treatment. And once Social Security is able to have a clearer picture of the child's functioning in all activities in the settings of home, school, and the community, they can consider how evaluating the child's functioning they evaluate the child's functioning in 6 domains, and they're broad areas of functioning intended to capture all of what the child can and cannot do. And so those 6 domain areas are acquiring and using information, attending and completing tasks, interacting and relating with others, moving about and manipulating objects, caring for yourself, and the health and physical well-being. And so if the child's impairment results in a marked limitation, going back, yeah, so again, if looking at those areas, if it results in a marked limitation in 2 of the 3 of the domains of functioning or extreme limitation in 1, then their impairment would functionally equal one of the listings. Oh, go ahead, Kendra.
There's just another question in the chat box, and I think it kind of fits here.
Okay.
The question is, does the analysis have to be from a medical source, or can you provide anecdotal evidence from third parties? And I think, when we're looking anecdotal evidence from third parties, things like IPPs, IEPs, that type of thing can be really helpful. I will say, something from a medical physician is always carries a lot of weight with Social Security. But I would always argue for as much and both as possible when kind of doing that initial application.
Definitely. I completely agree. I think this is a good stopping point to see if anybody else has any other questions before we move on to talking about what income Social Security counts for supplemental security.
There's another one, Rachel, for you. Are they doing
Sure.
their evaluation based on reports the parents will provide, or do they do their own medical assessment?
As far as I know, they do it on the reports that parents or the individual applying for benefits provides to Social Security. And like Kendra said, you can use both the medical documentation, but also things like IEPs, IPPs, maybe a psychological evaluation from if someone has regional center eligibility, the basis for that. Kendra, do you know otherwise?
They will bring you in for an assessment. Social Security, they do that sort of initial, they look at what you submit with the application, and then they will assess. They have their Social Security has a department, and it's confusing because they call it DDS, their Disability Determination Services. And you guys are all probably more familiar with the Department of Developmental Services through the Lanterman Act. So it's a different department, but it can get confusing. And so they will sometimes say, you're going to have an appointment with X, person X, who is a psychologist or a physician who's going to evaluate you. And so they will do both. There's also a couple questions about the differences between SSI and SSDI, and I'm happy to chat with you guys about that, but maybe we do that at the end of this, because it's a kind of a different discussion and it could confuse things a little bit. So if everybody's okay with that, we can maybe answer that question at the end of the training.
Rachel,
Is that the same, Kendra, for someone that's in the application process? Or is that something we want to wait to the end? Someone is actually going through something through an application process. I'm not sure if you see it or not.
Yeah, I'm seeing that now. They have records terminologist. Yeah, they many times want to have their own physician or assessor look at the individual. So you can provide from your own physician, but many times they will do that. So that's not uncommon.
Yeah, I guess the question is do you have to have a current IQ exam because of an autism diagnosis?
No.
Is that common?
You don't have to have a current. They may want one. So the IQ score for the autism, if you look at the diagnostic criteria, is not necessarily one of the things that they necessarily need to prove autism. And if you were arguing autism and maybe a co-occurring intellectual disability, then that would be something that you would want to have relatively current information on. It just depends on the individual and sort of how their disability manifests itself. And it's hard because Social Security, the reason why we see a lot of denials is Social Security is really good at clear medical things. Like you have a broken back, You can pull up an x-ray, you can identify that the back is broken, and it's very easy to see. Well, individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities, it's different. It's more nuanced. Say, some people are very skilled in some areas and have areas of development in others. So it's not as clear cut. And, it's been my experience that the assessors at Social Security don't always have as much experience with that, which is why you hear that it's such a rigmarole to get somebody eligible. I would pull together as much information as you have. If you're in the application, take a look at the listings, give Rachel a call, and look at that. And when you're filling out the application, use medical terminology. Terms like learning disability are not clear to Social Security and will usually get somebody denied, because there are plenty of people with learning disabilities who have very active and competitive employment. So using medical terminology, pulling that together, looking at what Social Security's language is around the asserted disability can get you a lot further down the line. I hope I answered your question.
This is Kathleen from Family Focus. We have a number of questions. We also had a raised hand before, but I don't see it anymore. But we did have a couple of people asking about when to apply. If one example was, my child's turning 18 in October, when would I apply? So that's one question, and then there's several others.
I think with the application process, I guess the one way to frame it is, if you apply for Social Security benefits, in this case, supplemental security income, before the age of 18 and are approved, and we'll talk actually about this towards the end of the training, at the age of 18, there is a redetermination as to whether someone should continue to have supplemental security income. So that's not to say you have to wait until someone turns 18, because then you only have to do it once. But if you do apply before the age of 18, at 18, there will be a redetermination.
Okay, thank
So
you.
of course. I think, kind of going back to it, it's important to take a look at, prior to applying, it's like what Kendra was talking about, and I have an advocacy tips slide as well, but it's important to take a look at the listings prior to application, and looking at the sequential evaluation, and taking a look at the documents you already have on hand, whatever medical documents you have, any assessments, IEPs, IPPs, psychological assessments, to see if they would be beneficial and helpful in terms of Social Security reviewing them to provide evidence as to the need for the supplemental security income.
Okay, thank you. There's also another question from a foster parent. They're waiting on Regional Center for an assessment for autism. Aside from her medical condition, that would be all throughout her life. Should DCFS apply for her, or would it be automatic to be applied for her after assessment? I'm not sure. Go ahead.
If I'm understanding correctly, I don't think that, I mean, having medical documentation showing a diagnosis of autism could be or would be helpful in terms of meeting the listing of impairment. And so Kendra, would you suggest that someone potentially wait until after receiving a psychological, unless you have other documentation already showing that there is an autism diagnosis?
Well, the question says aside from her medical condition, so this is a little unclear. It might be one where you want to call Rachel. And I think the question also is, should DCFS apply, or would it be automatic to be applied for her after the assessment? I don't know if through the DCFS or the dependency system, there is a automatic application made for SSI. That I don't know the answer to. You could always assume that it's not, and I would check in with whomever is doing the dependency there as to whether it's being applied for. There's another question about you including an IEP and previous IEPs. Sorry, excuse me. I would be careful. I would look at the IEP. How does it read? IEPs are written in a positive way, which they should be, and you're setting goals. And sometimes Social Security can latch onto things in the IEP that are very positive and say that the child is not eligible. So I would, I would read through, I wouldn't just automatically include any records. I would read them and see, are they helpful for the points that you're trying to make?
Definitely.
And I will stop talking and let Rachel have her presentation back.
Oh, no, that's
I
fine.
have a tendency to talk too much.
So there are a
Rachel,
number.
one last question about
Okay, go ahead.
applying. Someone asked, is it better to apply over the phone or online?
Mm,
I don't think they're taking in-person visits right now, so.
They're not taking in-person visits. You are able to apply both on the phone, over the phone and online. I don't know that, I don't know that there's necessarily one better than the other. Maybe with the fact of applying online, you have a little more time to maybe think critically about some of the questions in terms of how you're going to answer them instead of maybe being put on the spot when trying to do things online. I'm sorry, over the phone. I have not done an over the phone application, so I'm not exactly sure how fully it goes in with the Social Security representative who you're speaking with. I don't know whether or not one would necessarily be better than the other. Do we
Rachel,
have,
there's, I'm
okay.
sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna ask if we have more questions.
Another question regarding assets that
Okay.
they were looking like they were going to be approved until they got to the part of regarding assets.
Mhm.
And because their vehicle was worth over $5,000, that made their child ineligible. This is for a minor, a 6-year-old. Is that accurate?
We will, so in this next section that we're just about to start, I'll be talking about what income Social Security counts for supplemental security income, and vehicles are included in that. Typically, from my understanding and reading on Social Security website under the resources page, they do not take into consideration the value of one vehicle. If there is more than one vehicle, then they would take into consideration the value of any other vehicles outside of one vehicle. So so if there's one vehicle and then there's a second one that has a value of $5,000, then they would take into consideration the $5,000 if it was a secondary vehicle.
Okay. Do you want to hold off on additional questions or take one
Yeah.
more?
Why don't we continue on? And then we can circle back at the end. Just I want to be able to make sure that we can move through the rest of the material, and again, I'm happy to field calls with people if they want to call our office. I'm more than happy to talk with you more fully about supplemental security income or other questions you may have.
Thank you.
Of course. So now we're going to take a look at what income Social Security counts in determining supplemental security income. So there are different types of income. The first is deemed. So someone had brought up someone had asked a question about a parent's income being counted towards their child, and so that's called deeming. So an income from a parent if someone is under the age of 18, and also a spouse's income can be deemed to their spouse who is applying for supplemental security income as well. There's earned income. So shortly, it's income from a job if someone is working. So it's wages or earnings from employment, and also can include royalties or honoraria as well. And then we have unearned income. And this is income that is comprised of income an individual receives other than wages. So it can be Social Security benefits, pensions, state disability payments, unemployment benefits, interest income, and cash from friends and relatives. So that's unearned income. And then we have in kind, which shortly is food and shelter, a little more expansive, this is income that's comprised of food or shelter an individual receives for free or less than the fair market value from another person, such as parents. So it's what happens when someone else pays for or provides someone food or shelter. And often in-kind income can cause supplemental security income benefits to be less. And so income both earned and unearned is used by Social Security to decide the amount of supplemental security income. And the more earned and unearned income you receive, the less the supplemental security income will be. So a little more in depth is the deeming process. And so this is the process of determining how much of a parent's or spouse's income and resources Social Security will use in determining SSI payments for a child or the other spouse. So Social Security considers some of the parent's income and resources to be available to their children or child. And again, they consider a spouse's income and resources to be available for the other spouse. And the resources may affect whether a child can get Social Security income benefits, and that income will affect so it can affect whether or not they get income benefits generally, and then if they are still able to receive benefits, it will affect how much they can receive. And again, just to throw it back out there, if anybody has specific questions about deeming to a specific fact pattern or case, you can go ahead and contact my office and we can talk more fully about that. So looking at what income doesn't count. So $20 a month of earned or unearned income does not count towards the mathematical equation to determine how much benefit someone will receive. So just going back over, earned income is wages or earnings, and unearned income is income an individual receives other than wages, such as Social Security benefits, pensions, disability payments, unemployment. And so $20 of those two sections would not be counted. And then $65 a month of earned income is also not counted. So you take the $20 and the $65 away if there is earned or unearned income for it to be taken away from. And then you have additionally 1/2 of earnings, generally speaking, are not counted. And then in case of a child, it's 1/2 of a child's with their disability earnings are not counted as well. And Kendra had made mention of this a little while ago, but for students who are in school, so for a child who is disabled who is regularly attending school, college, or university, or a course of vocational or technical training, they can have limited earnings that are not counted against their supplemental security income benefits. So for a student under the age of 22 and they're working, $1,930 a month would not count towards the supplemental security income benefit. So that would be a maximum of $7,770 for the year 2021. And like with substantial gainful activity, the monthly and annual rate change every year. So it is important, or you are able to look up those amounts on the Social Security website. So in 2022, it would be likely that those amounts would increase as they have continuously over the years. Okay. Now, this kind of goes back to the question I answered regarding automobiles. It's what resources does Social Security count? They count any cash, they count bank accounts, stocks, savings bonds, land, life insurance, second automobile. So again, they don't count the first automobile, and anything you own which could be changed or changed to cash and used for food or shelter. And then looking at what resources does SSA not count. So the house you live in, which being your principal place of residence. But if you own more than one home, then Social Security will count the second home as a resource. And then one car, there are some exceptions. And again, if you have questions about that, please call my office and we can look more fully into those. Life insurance policies with a face value of $1,500 or less, burial plots, a burial fund up to $1,500, household good and personal effects. And this is really important to note for anybody who is applying for supplemental security income or has already supplemental security income. Your resources for an individual or a child cannot at any time exceed $2,000. And for a couple or parents, it cannot exceed $3,000. So for instance, if you receive let's say a lump sum payment, a retroactive payment from like an agency like IHSS for $10,000, and you also have supplemental security income, then there are options that you can take. You could potentially put that $10,000 lump sum payment into a CalAble account or a special needs trust, or you have the option to spend that money down. And we would recommend that you spend it down to below the $2,000, well, below the mark to where your overall resources wouldn't exceed $2,000. So if you just have $10,000 and no other resources to account for, then we would recommend spending it down to about $1,500 so that it's not exceeding the $2,000 mark.
And what's income this month becomes a resource next month. And that's why we say spend it down a little further than that resource limit, because anything that would roll over from one month to the next becomes a resource.
Exactly. Thank you, Kendra. Okay. So how much SSI benefits does someone living in California receive in 2021? So if someone is considered aged or disabled, you can receive $954.72. If someone is blind, it's $1,011.23. For a child, it's $895.15. But the amount a child receives can depend on the household income, and we do actually have a publication on disabilityrightscalifornia.org, and under self-advocacy, there's a tab, the self-advocacy tab, and then looking under Social Security, there is a specific publication on deeming, which has some really helpful information. And then if you're living in the household of another, someone could receive up to $693.58. Okay. I guess we can take a moment right here to see if anybody has any additional questions about income or anything that they weren't able to ask earlier.
Rachel, it's Kathleen. There is a question regarding special needs trusts, if the money there would affect the ability to be approved for SSI.
And Kendra, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not believe that money within the special needs trust fund would count towards the resource limit. So from what I understand, it should not affect the application for supplemental security income.
If it's drafted correctly, yes.
Okay.
There's a lot of rules around special needs trusts and how they're drafted and what monies can go into them. So you would want to speak with an attorney who specializes in special needs trust for that. The purpose of a special needs trust is to allow an individual to access certain public benefits like Social Security. So in theory, you're correct, but I always add that caveat because every now and then we get one that isn't drafted correctly or has different provisions and therefore would be considered.
So
I always
Rachel,
hate the "it depends" answer, but that one's kind of an "it depends."
So it's Kathleen, and there was a question, a clarification, and it just moved down. Sorry, with the chat, it's a little tougher they move quickly. So if the adult lives at home, they get $693.58 is one question. And then another question, so how can a family save if they can't have more than $3,000?
Well, that is a good question. So I believe a child who is still living in the home of a parent can receive up to $895.15, but you have to take into consideration the deeming. So the amount could be less if once they deem parents' resources or income to the child. And then in terms of how can someone save, go ahead, Kendra.
SSI, supplemental Security income is a needs-based program. It is specifically for individuals that have limited resources and income. So Social Security feels that if you have additional income, then you would not be saving that, you would be spending it. So it is a program for individuals with limited income and resources. Other Social Security benefits are more like an insurance benefit where you can have resources and you can have some income. And that's kind of different. But social SSI supplement is a needs-based program for individuals with disability and limited income and resources. So the thought is if you're able to save, then you can use that money that you're saving for benefits. I understand it's very difficult because $2,000 is not a lot of money. It's not like you're saving up a mint there. And it makes it very difficult to live, but it's extremely frustrating. But that is the thing with SSI. And with SSI, you're categorically eligible for Medi-Cal, which shares the same income and resource limitations, because it's also needs-based if it's linked to SSI. So I don't have a great answer for that. It is frustrating, and that's just.
So Rachel, the question before regarding an adult somebody living at home, if the amount would be $693.58 was, they said my question was if they are an adult and living at home with her parents, would the amount $693.58?
It would depend on whether or not Social Security is taking in-kind support and maintenance payments out. If that person is living in the home of their parents, but they're paying rent and their fair share of the food and of the utilities, then they would, in theory, be able to receive the full benefit amount. If it's less, typically, if it's an adult living in the home of their parent, it's usually because there's been an in-kind support and maintenance deduction, which is like a third.
Rachel, there are a few questions in the Q&A that I think we haven't really touched on for a little while. One of them is about the government stimulus payments, the COVID payments. Someone says, are those counted?
From what I did some reading about it, and from what I understand, those would not be counted towards the supplemental security income.
Yeah, they're excluded. They're excluded for a year.
Great. And someone else asks, if life insurance is in the name of a special needs trust, is that counted?
If it's under a special needs trust, then I don't believe it would be counted.
Okay.
If the trust is properly.
If it's properly drafted, yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I have to have a lawyer. I got to add the caveat.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay. And someone asked about land. Does owning land count as assets if it's in another country? And also, does own community land count? So I guess that's land here.
There are aspects for when land does count as a resource. I will say that again, I don't have the palms up right in front of me, but I can provide this information at a later time as well. But when looking at the Social Security palms, like their regulations, it does break down a pretty exhaustive list of what resources does count for Social Security, and there are some different variations of when land does count. Again, I don't have that up right in front of me, but I am happy to look up that information and provide that after the presentation is over.
And I will say, like, a home in another country does count. I've had a number of clients who have homes in Mexico or other countries, and if they're in addition to the home they own, then they do count.
Okay. And one final one in the Q&A. What is the maximum gross income a single parent can make when applying for themselves and one child only? Well, I think that's kind of a tricky question. I think it depends.
Yeah, we would have to do math, which you don't want us to do in front of a bunch of people. I would call our office. It really it depends on the amount of so it's the income with the $85 disregard. You cut that number in half. You subtract that from the federal benefit rate. So I would call us and we can do the math with you individually.
We definitely can, and I can, we have a publication that breaks down the math really nicely and talks about deeming as well. So we can go through that together. I'm just looking at the time and the amount of slides that I have left. I think it might behoove us to continue on, and then we can circle back to questions at the end if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Thank you. So, very important to note and to remember about what information must be reported to Social Security. So a person receiving a supplemental security, their beneficiary or representative payee, which can be a parent or a family member, must report any and all changes that might affect eligibility or payment by the 10th month after the month in which it occurs. So if there is a change to income or a change in resources or something that would affect eligibility or payment in January, if that's when the change takes place, the change must be reported by February 10th. And it's important to, and I won't get too deep into this because it's a very large topic in its own, but it's important to report all of these changes because if not reported and there is a discrepancy with the benefits that should have been received, Social Security will provide you a document and indicate that there is an overpayment and request that money be returned. And if that type of situation has arisen in anybody's cases, you can also give our office a call and we can talk about overpayment. I don't want to get too deep into that topic though.
I would not wait until the 10th of the month. I would do it by the 5th at the latest, and I would never ever use the drop boxes that Social Security puts out for, like, if you're a parent and you're working, you have to like submit pay stubs every month. I would never use the drop box. I don't know where they go. I'm not sure they go anywhere. They go into the ether. I would use like their online system where you get a receipt and keep proof of anything you ever give Social Security. Get a receipt
Absolutely.
from them. Just a practice tip.
That's a great tip. And then looking at retrospective monthly accounting. So just also to note that any changes that happen with regard to really anything, that would be reflected in March benefits check. So if there's a change in any changes in income, resources, or whatnot's reported, that change would be reflective in March.
So for example, I work this month, I turn in my paycheck stubs by the 5th of February. Social Security will then, in theory, through the month of February, look at that and say, you know what, we paid you too much for January because of how much that you made. So we're going to give you less of a check in March to make up for what we paid you. Or we didn't pay you enough, we'll pay you more. So it's you see it a couple months later. It makes things kind of confusing, but that's also why you want to know sort of what you gave Social Security when.
Exactly. Thank you, Kendra. So I'd like to move now into the application process and just talk a little bit about that. So this is just a little bit of information right now, especially during the coronavirus, to how to apply for Social Security, or I'm sorry, Supplemental Security Income. You can call Social Security the 1-800 number. That is their main 1-800 line. They are open 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday. I will say that wait times haven't been as extensive as anticipated, but I'm sure that varies day to day. You can also apply online through the link below, and you'll get a call from Social Security office to schedule a phone appointment. I will say the wait time for a phone appointment was not necessarily for applications. I'm not sure where that is at this point, but just generally for questions to Social Security to get an appointment time, that was about 3 weeks out. The last time that I spoke with them. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about sources of information to include with the application, and we kind of went through this already. So when looking at medical information, you'd want assessments or evaluations from licensed doctors, psychologists, therapists, any hospital records and medical records. And when looking at non-medical, potentially letters from parents, teachers, regional center service coordinators, IHSS providers, neighbors, people who would have valuable insight and information into someone's, if they we'll say they have a developmental disability, so being able to provide helpful information around someone's developmental disability and their need. Okay, so for an initial meeting with Social Security when applying for supplemental security income, these are a list of things that you should have for that meeting: birth certificate, proof of income and resources, and then medical proof, including having an organized medical records, easy to look through, supplementary records from regional center, looking at records from CCS and doctors, hospitals, clinics, and specialists. And then also important to have name, addresses, and telephone numbers of doctors, hospitals, and clinics if you don't have records. I have heard of applicants or their parents who are applying for a minor being asked specifically for names and addresses and telephone numbers of those medical professionals. And then just a tidbit on potentially how to accelerate the application process: have access to the school assessments and the IEPs. And like Kendra gave you somewhat of a warning, which I think is very valid, is to look carefully at what the IEP says. And like Kendra had said, it's they're positive, as they should be, but you want to make sure that that they are not necessarily detrimental to the application for supplemental security income. And then just a little repetitive, but having the name, addresses, and telephone numbers for care providers and family members that can provide information about a person's functional abilities. And then also helpful to have a description about how, we'll just say, for instance, a developmental disability affects the ability of an adult or child to function on a daily basis, or, and more specifically for adults, how it affects their function and ability to work. Okay. So tips for how to prepare for the initial application: review a sample SSI application, organize all your medical records and maybe letters from professionals in a binder. Keep all of that. Like we had mentioned a couple of times, review the Social Security listings. They may seem a little daunting at first, but really helpful to review. Give our office a call. We can walk you through the applicable listings. Provide copies of records at the appointment with the field representative. You don't want to just rely on Social Security to obtain those records. And then ensure that your records are stamped with the date and time that they were provided to Social Security. You want to keep really good records of all of that. And I will say another tip that I like to give families is, when you receive any documentation, and this is just generally across the board from Social Security, from IHSS, Regional Center, to keep the document, but also to keep the envelope. And I'll reiterate this in our next session next week, because when talking about appeals, but you'll want to have the envelope because that provides you with a stamp indicating the date that it was received, and that date is very important, but we'll get more into that next week. Okay. How long does it take for SSI eligibility application? How long does the process take? It can take several months, but if a person's condition is extremely severe, then Social Security may presume that that person has a disability. And just as a note, supplemental security income benefits can be paid for up to 6 months while the formal disability decision is being made. And then someone must meet all of the other supplemental security income eligibility factors. So that's looking at income and resources. Again, if you are a child or individual not having more than $2,000, or a couple or a parent not having more than $3,000. Okay. And so just generally examples of extreme severe eligibility conditions that may presume a disability could be total blindness, total deafness, cerebral palsy in some cases, and Down syndrome. Okay. I think we can stop for maybe a couple of minutes to answer some questions, and then we'll talk about mandatory redetermination.
Hi, Rachel. It's Teresa.
Hi, Teresa.
If a child is living with their parent that's receiving SSI, does it affect them qualifying for FAFSA?
That is a great question. Kendra, do you have any, if FAFSA would be affected by that?
I have no idea. We'd have to do some research.
I'm
We
happy
have
to
not
look into that.
I have not gotten that specific question.
I will put that on my my list of research to do, and I will and if it's okay, I can either, if the person who has that question, they can reach out directly to my office so that I have your contact information, or I can provide that information to Teresa and she can maybe give it to the right individual, whatever is
Because
easiest.
I know on the application it will ask,
Mm-hmm.
because they do ask parents for their income. So yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Another question is, our son is now 23. Should we take an old IEP from the school if it supports his assessment, or just his IPP and other provider documentation plus medical assessments?
And Kendra, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure that there's I would say a limit on when an IEP can be used. If looking at the IEP and it's helpful towards that SSI application, then I think that it could still be used as a basis of evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what is the best evidence rule? You know, is it current? Does it speak to, I mean, 23 isn't that old if they received, you know, services until the age of 22. Perhaps there's a really good transition statement in there that talks about pre-vocational skills or ability to work, and so that might have a lot of information around that. I think it would just depend on sort of the individual situation. Yeah, it would depend. So you could always call Rachel, and we can always take a look at the IEP and give you our opinion.
Any other questions before I move forward?
Looks like there's one more. Rachel, this is how many months of medical records?
I mean, I get at least the last 6 months of medical records, but I think it's as far back as it can go in terms of, I mean, if there's a psychological evaluation that is older because it was for regional center eligibility, but it's helpful in terms of the application, then I think that could still be useful. So I think it's more looking at what out of the medical records that you do have, which ones are helpful in forms of evidence, and then if they are helpful, I would say utilize those.
There was a question about what agents, let me see here. It's a little hard to go back. Can I submit medical forms that were filled out by a doctor for other agencies like IHSS, Medi-Cal, or an application for a service dog?
I don't see why not. Kendra, do you have any opposition to submitting something that's used for another agency?
No, I mean, we use regional center records all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not
Again,
sure if you answered this already, Rachel.
Sure.
Is an adult child that's living at home who pays rent to the parents considered living in household of another?
It would still, it would be a child, no, it would be a child living with the adult. So it would be the child benefit, but they would take a look at the amount of rent being paid, and they would use that to balance out the supplemental security income benefit.
And I would also think, Rachel, they would probably need to make sure they're having some type of receipt from the shows. Yeah. Okay.
I think that in any circumstance, when you're providing money to someone else on a regular basis, you should have a receipt for that.
I like to have a simple rental agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Spelled out. I mean, when I rent any I mean, in some ways, anything that you rent as an adult, you know, you should have some sort of a rental agreement. Your parents are no different, and it just makes it very clear.
Absolutely.
Jumping around, let's see.
And we can also move forward a little bit if we want and come back.
Sure.
Okay, great. So what I had mentioned before is at the age of 18, there is a mandatory redetermination. So this must happen even if the person receives supplemental security income under the age of 18. And then once they turn the age of 18, then they will need to meet the adult definition of a disability. And if an individual doesn't meet the adult definition, the benefits may continue if the individual is participating in special education, vocational rehabilitation, employment, or other support services, and the benefits may last until age 22 when special education services would terminate. And with the redetermination, the review usually occurs within 12 months of the 18th birthday, and it may be initiated as early as the month prior to the 18th birthday. And the age 18 redetermination is treated as an initial application for supplemental security income using, again, the adult disability criteria. And Social Security will review the applicant's income, resources, and living arrangements to make sure that that person is still eligible for SSI and is getting the correct payment. And if the person having the redetermination is married or is a child with a disability under the age of 18 and living with their parent, Social Security will also review the recipient's resources and living arrangement of the recipient's spouse or parent. So that's the deeming that we spoke about earlier. And Social Security redetermines eligibility and benefit amounts for most beneficiaries every 1 to 6 years. And again, when someone reports a change that can affect eligibility or payment, for example, like getting married, Social Security may review the recipient's income, resources, and living arrangements at that time. And then just noting, the substantial gainful activity requirement is not a part of the age 18 redetermination process. And if the review results in eligibility, so continued eligibility under supplemental security income, SSI and Medi-Cal continue uninterrupted. If the review results in a denial, then benefits are terminated 2 months after the date of the notice, and Social Security does not apply the ineligibility back to the month after the 18th birthday. And then there's also something called a continuing disability review. So once you're approved for disability benefits, Social Security will conduct a continuing disability review every few years to see if someone's condition has improved. And the benefits may not usually be terminated unless there is a finding that there has been a medical improvement. And the medical improvement standard requires a decrease in the medical severity of the impairment based on changes in signs, symptoms, or laboratory findings. And this is a cite to the POMS. This is what I spoke about earlier, kind of their rules and regulations. So this section of the POMS talks more specifically about the medical improvement standard. Then we have the comparison point decision. When evaluating medical improvement, the recipient's current impairments are compared to their impairments at the time of the most recent favorable medical decision or review. So that's called the comparison point. And so they're only looking at impairments for which there was medical evidence at the time of the comparison point decision. And then with looking at continuing disability review for children, that's about every 3 years. And just as a little bit of a nuance, but they will do the continuing disability review by the child's first birthday if their eligibility was based on low birth weight. Okay, and so just a little last bits of advocacy tips about supplemental security income. Again, report changes to the local SSA office within 10 days. So you must report a change of address and living arrangement if you get married, if you're admitted into a nursing home, hospital, prison, or jail, if you have income, including different income, including wages and new resources, or if you've taken trips outside of the US for 30 or more days. And we have a little bit of time to do about 15 more minutes to do questions and answers. And that is my contact information. I do see that the state says CCA, and that should just be CA. That is my name and my title, and the 213-213-8118 is our office's line. When contacting that number, you will first speak with our Assistant Clients Rights Advocate, Fatima, and she will do an intake and then able to communicate with me on next steps and what further communication needs to take place. And then also, just as a aside, Teresa or Kathleen or Victoria, what is the best way to send around either a link to a SurveyMonkey so individuals can fill out a survey, or if not, I can send over a document that's like a survey document. Is there a good way to do that?
Yeah, this is Victoria. We have all the people who registered for the webinar, we have their email addresses. So
Okay.
A number of people have been asking if they can get a copy of this presentation. So if you would agree to send us the presentation, and then you can send me a link to your survey, we will make sure it gets out to everybody.
Yeah, and Kendra, that, I mean, we're okay with sending the PowerPoint.
Yeah, I put it in the chat box that we go ahead and send it over. We send it over in a Word document. It looks a little different because PowerPoint itself is not always the most accessible for screen readers and other things. So we make it accessible, but it'll have all the same information. It just might look a little different. We'll go ahead and send that over. We can also send over some publications that we have that are really helpful. We can send Rachel the Deeming Pub, and we'll look at any others that seem like they're appropriate for today's discussion, and we can send those as well. The Deeming Pub has sort of the formula for you to use to determine how your income would be deemed. So it's very helpful.
This is Kathleen. Rachel, there's a couple questions.
Sure.
In the chat. So one of them, can you speak to becoming the representative payee? At what point in the process does that happen?
I will be honest, I don't have the greatest amount of knowledge about becoming a representative payee. Kendra, do you have any tips, and that may, it's a little out of the scope of this, but I'm not sure if we have any information.
I have a little bit. So for children, the parents receive the payment on behalf of their children. For adults, Social Security determines whether or not somebody needs a representative pay. So that's a determination they make on their end. And then who that person is, they also sort of determine. Typically, it's a family member. There are organizational representative payees. A person can nominate somebody to be their payee, and then Social Security sort of vets them, and then we'll determine if they're going to be the payee. But it is something that Social Security determines if it's needed in their analysis of the case.
I know we had a question if this presentation will be in Spanish, and I believe our staff is working with Rachel now on providing that. And at the end of the meeting, we'll put in our information. The best way to really stay on top of our different presentations is to sign up for our newsletter and to definitely check in on our website, because we're constantly adding new presentations. So once we have that date squared away, we will have this in Spanish. So we'll provide that information at the end for our website and signing up for our newsletter.
Absolutely. I am working right now with Family Focus, and we've either come to a conclusion for dates or are in the process, but I will be providing the same training in Spanish.
Okay, so we have another question in the chat.
Sure.
This one came up a few times. My daughter's birthday is in July. How far in advance should we start the process?
Well, I mean, I think that, I mean, it's a little more specific. Are they saying that because that specific person is turning 18? I think you can,
Yeah.
I mean, start the process in terms of at any time, as long as you're looking at the documents that we talked about, like the listings and the sequential evaluation, and looking at all of the medical documents to make sure that there is the adequate evidence for the SSI application. But I don't think that there's a specific cutoff or start time where the application should be started, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Another question, when should one take on an application themselves, and when is it advisable to contact your offices? Who do you select to advocate for or on behalf of?
So if you have any questions with regards to supplemental security income, anybody can go ahead and give our office a call. We do take a look at our office's resources in terms of the level of advocacy that we can provide, but I am happy to sit down and talk with individuals regarding the supplemental security income. It really just, the level of advocacy really would just depend on where someone is in the application process and what needs to happen next and what our office's resources are. But we are open to every call that comes in. We will make sure to at least have a conversation with you to, well, not at least, but we will have a conversation with you to better understand what's currently going on and what next steps should be.
Okay, we had a number of people that said thank you so much, and this was very informative, and they really appreciate it. So I wanted to make sure to mention that, and that it was an excellent presentation. And then maybe this might be the last question. Is there a waiver to exempt parents from income from the child?
I'm not aware. Kendra, are you aware of a waiver to exempt a parent's income?
So what I think you're thinking about is the Home and Community-Based Developmental Disability Services Waiver, or the DD waiver, or institutional deeming. That is not for SSI eligibility. It will, like if you're not eligible for SSI due to income and resources, there is a way to access Medi-Cal, full scope, no share of cost Medi-Cal, where if a person is what we call institutionally deemed, which just means that they would require care in an intermediate care facility level or higher, and is a regional center client, then for the purposes of Medi-Cal, what they will do is they will not look at parental income for the individual, and they will only assess the income of the child. So if the child doesn't have any income, it would be zero. Some children have an income, but then that would be deemed for the purposes of Medi-Cal. But not for SSI.
Thank you. A couple things coming up that have come up, and I'll just answer those. The recording will be at our website tomorrow, and then the second session next week on January 28th will not be a repeat of the same information. That will address appeals and denials. Is that correct, Rachel?
Right.
Okay, and if you have questions, based on today's presentation and your own situation, definitely give them a call. That's in the box there. So did you have any other questions that you wanted we could answer right now, Victoria?
No, I don't see any. I just wanted to reiterate that as you just said, we'll put the presentation up on the Family Focus website. I just put in the link to that. It's the one that has csun.edu/Family Focus Resource Center. And when we get the presentation and the link to the survey from Rachel, we will send out an email to everybody who registered that lets you know the presentation is there. Please answer the survey, and you can go to our website and watch the recording. Okay,
right.
So it'll all come in one email.
And that recording will be at the Family Focus website. I think someone asked to clarify that.
Yes, I put the link in the chat.
There were a couple people in the chat that asked about the difference between SSDI and SSI, and I said I would give a little blurb about that at the end. I know that people may have other things to do, but we've got about 6 minutes left. Can I give a 4-minute rundown of the difference, and then maybe at the next one, if that question is still there, next week we can answer more fully.
Yes, thanks.
So there are two. So Social Security, the Social Security Administration administers a lot of different programs for a lot of different things. You have SSI, Supplemental Security Income. You have SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance. You have survivors benefits. You have all sorts of different benefits that Social Security administers, and they're separate programs that have separate rules. SSI, like we said, that's the need. That's needs based, and because you have a disability, so that is income and resources $2,000 or less, and you have a severely severe impairment. That's under Title 16 of the Social Security Act. And then there's a whole bunch of other benefits, SSDI, which are held under Title 2 of the Social Security Act. And that is more of an insurance benefit. So that's when you work and you pay into the system, and then you become disabled at some point in time. If you've worked and you've paid in for 40 credits, which is, I think, approximately 10 years worth of employment, then you can become eligible for benefits because you're disabled, but it's more of an insurance benefit. So for SSDI benefits, your resources, you can have $1 million and get SSDI because you've worked, you've paid in, you've become disabled, and so now you get that benefit. Similarly, if you're the disabled child of an adult who has worked and paid into the system, you can receive benefits once your parent triggers their benefits by retiring, becoming deceased, or disabled themselves. So you have what we call childhood disability benefits. They used to be called disabled adult child benefits, but those are all under sort of the Title II bandwidth, where the disability determination is the same, like we said at the beginning, but you can have resources. And in theory, you can have some income, but I always put a little asterisk there, because if you work to earn that income, working to earn income might show that you are able to be competitively employed and that you're earning, you're engaging in substantial gainful activity, which would then impact the disability determination and make you ineligible because they would find that you are no longer disabled. So different programs, one, you can have resources and receive based on work history. The other, you don't have to have worked a day in your life. You can't work and you're disabled and you have limited resources. So they're sort of on different sides of the spectrum. So I see a question, do SSDI benefits count towards SSI? Yes, that would be an example of unearned income. So what happens lots of times is somebody is an adult, they turn 18, they become eligible for SSI benefits. They lope along for years receiving their benefits. Their parent then retires. And when you're filling out your retirement application, they say, do you have a child with a disability? You say yes. And then all of a sudden, Social Security says, hey, you're eligible, child, for this SSDI benefit, this benefit off of your parents' work history. That benefit is typically more money than the SSI benefit. So Social Security is going to deem that. They're going to look at it and they're going to say, you're getting this much SSDI. We're going to put it through that calculator. And so you're no longer eligible for an SSI check or a very small check. And so then your SSI check either goes away entirely or you get $50 a month or some small amount of money. If that happens, you can retain your Medi-Cal eligibility, but you have to keep your resources under $2,000. So that's how some people get that. And then once you've received that Title II benefit, that SSDI, for 24 months, you become eligible for Medicare. So you can be under 65 without sort of the substantial illnesses and become eligible for Medicare under your parents' work history if you've received it for 24 months. So that's a lot of information in like a really short period of time. We have a great publication called Public Benefits for People with Disabilities that explains that and the differences. That's on our website. We can have Rachel send the link to that as well. I hope that answered your question a little bit.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming out, well, tuning in more or less, and I really appreciate it, and I hope you guys were able to learn something about supplemental security income.
Yes, absolutely. We did. We all learned so much. And just a reminder to everybody to sign in next week at the same time on the 28th, and there'll be part 2 with a lot more information. And maybe we'll have time to cover some more questions at that time as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Kendra.
Thanks, everybody.
And
Thank
don't
you.
forget to look at the Family Focus website for upcoming events.
Yes, we have lots of coming events. And actually, I'm going to share my screen just for
Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
a
There you go.
minute because I have a couple things I'll show. We have something coming up on February 4th. Is it, Kathleen? Which
Yes,
is
February 4th on CalAble.
CalAble. CalAble is a financial planning tool. It's a way for
It's a way to save and get SSI.
right. So this is a great, solution for people who said, well, what can we do to save and still have the person getting SSI be eligible for those benefits? And CalAble is one of the answers to that question. So that's on February 4th. And then we have a special education law and virtual learning webinar on February 17th in the evening at 6:30. And one of the topics that they will discuss is the funding that California is providing for elementary schools to get them ready for in-person learning. And then just an overview of what's currently going on with special education for all of our students. All right. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.